Somewhere in the last year, a rule changed in terms of your life, and you can name the agency that wrote it, but you cannot name a single person that voted for it. Consider almost any morning. The water heater in your basement, it runs at an efficiency standard set by the Department of Energy. The interest disclosure on your mortgage is formatted the way a federal bureau requires. The medication in your cabinet reached the shelf through an approval and manufacturing process the Food and Drug Administration designed. And what you, or more likely your insurer, paid for it may reflect Medicare rules, patent rules, and competition rules administered somewhere else again. The furnace, the dishwasher, the light bulb, the gas in your garage, the refrigerant in your air conditioner, each of them is shaped by a specific federal rule. Break one of those rules as a business and you can be fined, enjoined, or shut down. They can be legally binding and enforceable against the people and businesses they govern, in every way that matters to the person who must obey them. Now ask the question this episode is going to focus on. Who made that law? Not Congress alone. Congress passed a statute years or decades ago that said something broad and probably very pleasant. That appliances should be efficient. That drugs should be safe and effective. That the air should be clean. And then Congress handed the hard part. The part where the general aspiration becomes the specific command that lands on you, to an agency, to officials you did not elect, cannot vote out directly, and in most cases will never learn the names of. The elected body wrote the sentence everyone applauds. The unelected body wrote the sentence that governs you. Now, here is the strange and important truth at the center of the episode. The power was given away, handed over, deliberately and repeatedly by the very people the Constitution charged with holding it, and handed over much of the time because the holding of it was hard. It was difficult. But the giving it away, it actually was rather easy. On Saturday, we watched a generation of persecuted jurists build a doctrine about the office that must stand between the citizen and an overreaching power. Today, we turn that doctrine on ourselves, and we find the office in question is not standing against a tyrant at all. It is asleep at the post, and it fell asleep quite on purpose. This is episode 6, part B. And I am Jeff Kellogg on the Consequential Actions podcast. This is the contemporary application episode for episode 6 of our series, Self-Evident, The Road to 1776. On Saturday, in When Resistance is Lawful, we trace the Calvinist resistance theorists, Beza, Hartmann, and the anonymous author of the Vindici contra Tyrannos, and the Scot, George Buchanan, as they answered the question Luther raised at Worms and refused to resolve. Their answer was the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. Resistance to an overreaching power is lawful when it is undertaken not by the private individual, but by the constituted authorities of the realm, the offices that already exist to protect the people. And the historical episode closed by handing this episode a question. In a modern republic, who occupies the place of Beza's lesser magistrate? And how clean is the line in practice between lawful interposition and mere faction? Today I want to answer that question, and I want to answer in a way that you may not expect. The office the founders built most deliberately to stand between you and an overreaching executive is the Congress of the United States. And the story of this episode is not that Congress has been overpowered. It is that Congress has spent a century giving away its power. Before I go further, a word of accuracy that this material requires, because today I'm going to put my hands on live and partisan things. I'm going to talk about a Democratic president's program to forgive student debt and a Republican president's tariffs, both of them struck down by the Supreme Court on similar structural ground within a few years of each other. I want to be understood exactly. This episode this episode takes no position on whether student debt should be forgiven or on whether tariffs are wise or foolish. Those are real arguments, and you are entitled to your side of them, and so am I. And neither of them settles them here on this episode. We can talk in other forums about my direct opinions on each. Now, the target of this episode is not the policy per se. It is the question of who is allowed to make it. And that question does not care which party holds the White House, because the principle protects a citizen of every political persuasion in exactly the same way. It says that the law you must obey should be made by the people you can vote out. When the same doctrine strikes down a program from the left and a program from the right, that is not a doctrine playing favorites. That is a doctrine doing its job. As always, this episode expands on the themes of the article and the historical episode, and it takes them somewhere the historical hour could only point. Let us begin.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions Podcast. Here we ask a simple question of the history and the actions that have shaped our lives.
Did this leave us more free or more governed? Because what we do not know can be used to govern us.
And what we choose to ignore always will.
Let us start with what Beza actually said, because the whole of the episode turns on it. Beza's lesser magistrate was not a private man with strong opinions. He was the holder of a public office, a town magistrate, a provincial governor, a member of an estate or an assembly. And his authority to resist a tyrant came entirely from that office. It was not his to use as he pleased. It was a trust held on behalf of the people he was set over. And one of its central purposes was their protection. And here's the part the historical episode pressed the hardest, the part I want you to carry in through this hour. For Beza, resistance was not merely something the lesser magistrate was permitted to do. In the face of manifest tyranny, it is something he was obligated to do. The magistrate who stood aside while a king made war on his own people had not stayed neutral. He had betrayed the very office that gave him his authority in the first place. His silence was itself a breach of trust. Think of the office as a duty, because it has a second edge that the 16th century living under kings had less reason to notice than we do. A magistrate can betray his office in two different ways. The first is the one Beza was worried about. He can fail to resist a superior who has turned tyrant. He can see the overreach and do nothing. That is the failure that we built the A-part episode around, because that was the failure the Huguenots faced, magistrates who might have interposed against the crown and did not. But there's a second way to betray the office, and it is quieter, and in a republic, it is far more common. The magistrate can simply give the office away. He can take the power that was placed in his hands as a trust, placed there precisely so that he would stand between the people and some greater power, and he can hand that off to that greater power, because holding it is burdensome, and because the accountability that comes with holding it is politically dangerous. And because it is so much easier to let someone else make the hard decision and take the hard blame, he does not lose a sword in the fight. He sets it down and walks away from it. Now bring that here in our constitutional order. Which office was built to stand between the citizen and the concentrated power of the executive? Before I answer, I have one quick qualification, because a careful listener will have it ready. Congress, of course, is not literally a lesser magistrate beneath the president the way Beza's town magistrate sat beneath a king. Congress and the presidency are co-equal branches, equal in constitutional dignity, neither one the other's inferior. So the connection I am drawing is functional, not hierarchical. What Congress shares with Beza's magistrate is not a rank in a chain of command. It is the deeper thing. It holds a public power in trust, granted to it for the people's protection, and the holder of such a trust may not simply abandon the duties the office exists to perform. That is the thread. The analogy does real work without pretending Congress answers to the president. With that said, the very first sentence at the very first article of the Constitution reads, "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States." All of them. All of them. The power to make the law, the binding rule that confine you, close your business, take your liberty, was placed deliberately and exclusively in the branch closest to the people. The lawmaking power, which lodged in a representative body whose House faces the voters every 2 years, and whose senators, since the 17th Amendment made their election direct in 1913, now face them every 6. Both chambers today are elected by you. The founders did not scatter that power by accident. They concentrated the sword of lawmaking in the hands of the body that you can most directly reach at the ballot box. That was the design. That was the protection. The people who make the rules you must obey should be the people you can vote out when they make a mistake. And I will say plainly that this is my reading of the design, not the only check the Constitution built. The founders did not rely on Congress alone. They set the courts against overreach and federalism and impeachment and the appropriations power and the discipline of elections. But of all those checks, the placement of the whole lawmaking power in the elected legislature is the most direct, the one that says, before any court reviews anything, that the rule you live under was written by someone you can fire. And here's where the resistance theorists reach across 4 centuries and put a hard question to us. Beza's magistrate betrayed his trust when he failed to interpose against a tyrant. What do we say about a magistrate who does something Beza barely imagined, who takes the trust itself, the lawmaking power placed in his hands for the people's protection, and hands it to the very executive he was set there to check? Not overpowered, not defeated, simply, deliberately, and for his own convenience, abdicated. That is the story of the modern Congress, and it is the subject of the rest of this episode. So how exactly does a legislature give away the power to legislate? Not in one dramatic surrender, but in a habit so old and so comfortable that we have almost stopped seeing it as a choice at all. It works like this. Congress passes a statute, and the statute announces a goal. The air should be clean. The workplace should be safe. Financial products should be fair. Appliances should be efficient. These are the words that get the vote, the words a member can run for re-election on, the words that photograph well. And then the statute says, in effect, and the relevant agency shall issue such rules as are necessary to achieve this. The Environmental Protection Agency shall define the acceptable levels. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration shall set the standards. The agency shall decide what fair and safe and necessary actually mean in the specific binding, enforceable form that lands on real people. And in that handoff, the real lawmaking happens somewhere the voter cannot reach. The word safe in the statute does nothing to you. The 300-page regulation defining safe, that is what shuts your plant down. The general aspiration was written by people you elected. The specific command was written by people you did not. Congress took credit for the goal and handed off the cost of the details, and the details are where the law actually lives. Now, I want to be fair to the reasons because there are real ones, and the skeptic's case later will state them at their full strength. Modern government is vast and technical. Congress cannot itself specify the allowable parts per million of every pollutant or the testing protocol for every drug. Even most of the strong non-delegation theories permit Congress to authorize fact-finding, technical implementation, and the filling up of the details within a policy that Congress itself has chosen. I will come back to that line and give it its due. But necessity is not the whole of the story. It is not even most of the story, because there is a second reason Congress delegates, and it has nothing to do with the technical complexity and everything to do with the CYA, the self-protection. And here I want to be clear that the point I'm about to make is not original to me. Political scientists and administrative law scholars have made it for decades. David Schoenbrod most forcefully in a book whose very title names the problem, Power Without Responsibility. And Morris Fiorina in his work on why legislatures choose to regulate through agencies in the first place. What they observed is this. When Congress writes a vague statute and hands the hard choices to an agency, it purchases something very valuable to a politician: deniability. If the agency's rule is popular, the member of Congress can claim he passed the law that produced it. If the agency's rule is hated, the same member can rail against the unelected bureaucrats who imposed it, the very bureaucrats to whom he handed the pen. He gets the credit and escapes the blame. He votes for clean air in the abstract and never has to cast the specific, painful vote that tells a factory town exactly which jobs the clean air rule will cost. Delegation, in other words, is not only a response to complexity, it is frequently a flight from accountability. That is the established insight. What I want to add to it is older than the political science. It is Beza's. The credit claiming and blame shifting that Schoenbrod indicts is not merely bad incentives. It is the lesser magistrate refusing to do the hardest part of his job, the part where he makes a real decision and that real constituents can hold against him. And handing that part to the executive, not because the executive can wield it better, but because holding it himself would require him to answer for the cuts. The political scientists named the failure. What the resistance theorists let us see is that it is a failure of office, a betrayal of trust, and not just a clever career strategy. And the courts, for the most of the last century, let this happen almost without limit. There is a doctrine called the Non-Delegation Doctrine. In principle, it holds that Congress may not hand away its legislative power. It may authorize the executive to find facts and fill in details, but the policy judgments, the actual lawmaking, must remain with the elected branch. The court has never formally abandoned that principle. It still says, in so many words, that Congress may not transfer or abdicate the essential legislative functions. But in practice, the courts adopted a test so lenient, asking only whether Congress supplied some intelligible principle to guide the agency, that almost anything passed. The Supreme Court has not struck down a federal statute as an excessive delegation since 1935. So the limit exists on paper, and for 90 years it has been so permissive that no statute has crossed it. The office was permitted to abdicate again and again without a court ever saying stop. And so comfortably and continuously, it did. Now I have to introduce one more piece, because without it you cannot see why recent attempts to fix this problem have mostly missed. And here I'm going to lean on work I have already done. In the General Welfare series, I devoted a full segment to the arc of judicial deference, the line of cases running from Skidmore in 1944 through the 1984 decision in Chevron to its overruling in Loper in 2024. And I am not going to re-narrate that history today. If you want the case-by-case story, it is there in the General Welfare episodes, and I encourage you to go back and take a look at those. Fully told, what I want here is only the mechanism, how the thing actually worked, because the mechanism is what matters for this argument today. Here is the mechanism stripped to its bones. Congress writes a vague statute and hands it to an agency to administer. The agency then interprets the statute it administers, decides what the ambiguous words mean, sometimes in a direction that enlarges its own regulatory reach. They're not always. And the question becomes, when someone challenges that interpretation in court, what does the judge do? Under the Chevron doctrine, for 40 years, the judge did something remarkable. The judge first asked whether Congress had directly resolved the question. If the statute was ambiguous, though, the judge was then required to accept the agency's interpretation so long as it was a reasonable one, even if the judge, reading the statute himself, would have chosen a different answer as the better one. Now, Chevron does not command judges to swallow anything an agency said. Agencies lost cases under it, and a truly unreasonable reading would fail. But within the wide space of reasonable readings, the court did not decide what the law meant. It accepted what the agency said the law meant. So follow the incentive that creates, because it is the whole point. And let me be careful to call it an incentive, a tendency, not an iron law. If courts will generally accept any reasonable agency reading of an ambiguous statute, then ambiguity becomes an asset to the executive. A vague statute is not a bug, it is a feature, because vagueness is the space where the agency gets to make the call, and the reviewing court will usually let it stand. Chevron did not just tolerate the handoff of lawmaking from Congress to the agencies, it lowered the price of it by making it likely that the executive's reading of Congress's vagueness would prevail. The elected branch left the words blurry. The deference doctrine tended to make the blur work in the executive's favor. In 2024, in Loper Bright, the Supreme Court overruled Chevron, and this was hailed correctly as a genuine event, a real reassertion of the court's duty to say what the law is rather than defer to the executive's account of it. I'm not going to diminish it, but I want you to look at it very carefully at what it did and did not do, because this is the sharpest point in the entire episode. Overruling Chevron shifted the final authority to resolve statutory meaning in a litigated case from the executive agencies to the courts. Be precise about what that means and what it does not. It does not make judges the new lawmakers. It does not hand judges the discretionary policy choices that Congress had validly delegated to an agency. Loper Bright expressly left that delegated discretion in place. What moved was the power to say what an ambiguous statute means when someone sues. Where before an agency's reasonable reading controlled, now a federal judge decides, exercising what the court called independent judgment. And in the year and more since, the early evidence on what that has changed is genuinely mixed. Some studies find lower courts diverging sharply and newly issued agency rules being struck down at a high rate in the first months. Other work finds that formal deference regimes never mapped cleanly onto who wins anyway. What can be said with confidence is narrower, and it is enough for my argument. Ending Chevron did not make statutory ambiguity disappear, and courts exercising independent judgment still, in many cases, find the agency's reading to be the most persuasive one and reach the result the agency had reached. The power to resolve the ambiguity moved, the ambiguity itself did not. The statutes are exactly as vague as they were because the branch that wrote them vaguely has not been made to write them any other way. So do you see what happened? The final say over what a vague statute means moved from the executive bureaus to the judiciary chambers. Maybe, perhaps, in some cases. But Congress, the branch that created the vacancy in the first place by refusing to make its own law specific, sat out the entire transaction. Loper Bright did not force Congress to legislate more clearly, and it did not send the lawmaking home. It reassigned who reads the ambiguous text. It left untouched the habit that produces the ambiguity. This is the thing to understand about every deference fight. Every argument about how much courts should defer to agencies, they're all downstream. There are quarrels over who fills the gap that Congress left. None of them touches the gap itself. None of them ask the only question that would actually restore the constitutional design. Why is Congress writing laws so vague that someone else has to finish them? Which brings us to the one doctrine that does ask that question. There's a small group of judges who have spent years arguing that the whole framework is backward, that the problem was never which unelected official fills the gap, but the gap exists at all. Their instrument is the non-delegation doctrine. Their argument is that the court should stop asking whether an agency reasonably interpreted a vague statute and start asking whether Congress was allowed to be that vague in the first place. force the legislature to make the actual policy judgments itself, return the lawmaking to the lawmakers, and send the power home. The most forceful modern statement of this came in 2019 in a case called Gundy v. United States. The case itself was narrow, and the delegation in question was upheld. But Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote a dissent that has become the anchor text of the whole revival effort. His argument was almost a direct restatement of the theme of this entire series. If Congress can hand its legislative power to the executive, he warned, then the law risks becoming nothing more than the will of the current president, which is to say, precisely the concentration of lawmaking and executing in a single hand that the separation of powers was built to prevent. It is the collapse into one-man rule that the resistance theorists 4 centuries earlier were writing against. And in dissent, Gorsuch proposed replacing the court's exceptionally permissive modern approach with a more demanding rule. Congress may let the executive fill up the details and find the facts, but it must make the hard policy calls itself. That was his proposed constitutional test. It is not, and I want to be clear, the law today. It lost. But it is the banner the revival has marched under ever since. And here's the fact I most want you to consider, because it matters for what comes next in this episode. Gorsuch did not write that dissent alone. He was joined by Chief Justice John Roberts and by Justice Clarence Thomas. And 6 years later, in 2025, in a case called FCC versus Consumers Research, the revival effort was still alive. Gorsuch dissenting again, this time joined by Thomas and Justice Alito, arguing that a federal funding scheme handed the executive a taxing power with no real limit, and that this was exactly the kind of abdication the Constitution forbids. Note that the coalition had shifted. Thomas and Gorsuch carried through from Gundy, but where Roberts had joined them in 2019, it was Alito who joined them in 2025. They lost again. The delegation was upheld 6-3, but note what even the majority conceded in losing. The court signaled, in Gorsuch's own reading of it, that there are some abdications of congressional authority it is not prepared to stomach. The doctrine is not dead. It is a live warning, a rising dissent, a minority on the court insisting that the office of the legislature must not be allowed to hand itself away. I want to dwell for a moment on Justice Thomas, because he is going to be the center of the honest reckoning in a few minutes, and I will need the ground laid now. Across both of these cases, Gundy in 2019, Consumers Research in 2025, Thomas was a consistent vote for a stronger non-delegation doctrine, for forcing the core lawmaking power back into the elected branch. That is a 6-year through line, and it is a principled one. Whatever else you think of the man on this particular question, he has been what his admirers say he is, a justice who thinks Congress must not be allowed to hand away the powers that are Congress's own to keep. That's going to matter in a way that is more complicated than the first looks when we get to the reckoning portion of this episode. Now let me show you the doctrine's shadows. The 2 recent cases where the court did strike down an executive action and did it revealingly without quite reaching the non-delegation question at all. The first came against the Democratic president. In 2023, in Biden v. Nebraska, the Supreme Court struck down the administration's plan to forgive roughly $430 billion in federal student loans. The court held 6-3 in an opinion by Chief Justice Roberts that a program of that vast economic and political significance required clear congressional authorization, and that the statute the administration relied on did not supply it. The second case came against a Republican president in February of this year, 2026, in Learning Resources v. Trump. The court struck down the sweeping tariffs the administration had imposed under an emergency power statute. Tariffs of, in the court's words, essentially unlimited amount, duration, and scope. The court held, again 6-3, that the statute did not authorize them and that the power to lay tariffs belongs to Congress under Article 1 and cannot simply be claimed by the executive without a clear grant. Now, it would be easy to make these 2 cases look tidier than they are, and the tidy version would be false. Here's the honest one, because it is actually, I think, more interesting. It was not the same 6 justices in both cases, and it was not one single doctrine. In the student loan case, the 6 of the majority were the court's conservatives. In the tariff case, the 6 were a different mix entirely. 3 of the conservatives, Roberts, Gorsuch, and Barrett, joined this time not by the other conservatives, but by the court's 3 liberals, Kagan, Sotomayor, and Jackson. And those 2 blocs did not even agree on why the tariffs failed. Roberts, Gorsuch, and Barrett reached the result partly through the major questions reasoning, the demand for clear authorization before the executive does something of vast economic significance. And the 3 liberals refused that reasoning and got to the same result by ordinary statutory interpretation, that the word regulate simply does not mean tax. So the statute never authorized the tariffs in the first place. Same outcome, different coalitions, and different routes. So the symmetry I want you to see is not the same 6 justices apply the same doctrine to both parties. That would be too clean, and it's not what happened. The symmetry is deeper and it is narrower at once. In both cases, different justices, different reasoning, a Democratic program and a Republican one. The court arrived at the same basic constitutional demand. The executive must point to authority that Congress actually enacted. Strip away the doctrinal labels and the shifting lines up, and the common floor beneath both decisions, not one block protecting one party, a shared insistence, reachable by more than one path, assembled by more than one coalition, that a president of either party wants to do something enormous, has to find power for it in a law Congress passed. That is what a real structural principle looks like. It is robust precisely because different justices, different reasoning keep landing on it. But notice the thing the court did not do in either case. It did not say that Congress had unconstitutionally handed its power away. It said more narrowly that the executive had reached for power Congress had not clearly given. The court struck at the executive's grab, not the legislator's abdication. It's a push-pull thing. It treated the symptom, an executive claiming too much, and left the disease untouched. A Congress that writes statutes vague and broad enough to invite the grab in the first place. And that is precisely why the non-delegation dissenters keep writing. They are trying to get the court to name the disease. Killing Chevron treated a symptom. Striking down a particular tariff treats a symptom. Only forcing Congress to make its own laws, only the non-delegation principle, reaches the thing underneath. That is why Gorsuch and Thomas keep returning to it. They understand that you can strike down executive overreach one program at a time forever, and the power will keep flowing to the executive, so long as the legislature keeps handing it over. There is one more recent development, and it complicates the picture I've been drawing, so I will not leave it out to keep things simple. This June, in a case called Trump v. Slaughter, the court strengthened the president's control over the executive agencies, holding 6-3 that the commissioners of the Federal Trade Commission, because they exercise executive power, must be removable by the president at will, and overruling a 90-year-old precedent that will let Congress insulate them. Now, that cuts in an interesting direction against part of what I said in the open. I told you the agency officials who write the rules are people you cannot vote out. After Slaughter, that is simply less true. If the president can hire and fire them at will, then the rules they write are more directly attributable to one official in the executive branch who you can vote out, the president himself. Some people will say that actually answers the accountability worry. But look closer, because it does not dissolve the problem of this episode, it sharpens it. Slaughter does not make agency rules into acts of Congress, it makes them more firmly acts of the president. It takes the delegated lawmaking power and rather than sending it back to the legislature where the Constitution placed it, binds it more tightly to the executive. Justice Gorsuch, concurring, said the quiet part out loud. Overruling that old precedent does not cure the disease of the administrative state. It simply reallocates the power Congress poured into these agencies. And every allocation that is not a return to Congress is the same story in a new costume. The lawmaking power moving anywhere except back to the people you elect to make law. And now the reckoning. And today it's about doing justice to a man who would be easy to do an injustice to, and admitting that my first draft of the story was wrong. Here's the fact that has to be faced. In the tariff case, the case striking down a Republican president's signature economic program, Justice Thomas dissented. He would have let the tariffs stand. Now, if you hold Thomas the way many of his admirers do, the way I do, as something close to a pure constitutionalist, a man who follows the text wherever it leads, regardless of who it has helped or hurt, that dissent invites a quick and cynical reading, the great originalist protecting the president of his own side. And you might conclude that the whole principle above party story was just too good to be true. I want to tell you why that quick reading is wrong, but I will also have to tell you that the easy defense of Thomas is wrong too, including a version of it that I was tempted to do myself here in this episode. The tempting defense goes like this. Thomas has always distrusted the major questions doctrine as a judge-made presumption and preferred the cleaner structural rule of non-delegation. So his refusal to strike the tariffs on major questions ground is just consistency. That defense is neat. It's also false. And I'm not going to sell it to you because the record does not support it. Thomas has not been a major questions skeptic. He joined the court's major questions opinion in West Virginia versus EPA, the case that reined in the EPA's climate authority, and again in Biden versus Nebraska, the student loan case. So you cannot rescue his tariff dissent by claiming he distrusts the whole way of reasoning. He has used it. The honest reconciliation has to be harder won than that, and it is. Here's what Thomas actually did, and it holds together, but only if you follow it precisely. His non-delegation commitment has always been about a specific thing, the core legislative power, the power that sits at the heart of what it means to make law, which he says Congress may never hand away. The whole question then for any given delegation is whether the power at issue falls inside that protected core or outside of it. And on the tariffs, Thomas made two moves. First, on the statute. He read its authority to regulate importation as broad enough to reach the tariffs, a textualist reading a broad phrase broadly. Second, and this is the load-bearing move, he argued that the power to lay duties on imports in the particular setting of foreign commerce and the nation's dealings with other countries was not part of the non-delegible core in the first place, that this was a power at the border, entangled with foreign affairs of a kind that has long been shared with the executive. And so not the same as handing away the domestic lawmaking power that non-delegation exists to protect. You may reject either move. The majority rejected the first. 6 justices concluded the statute simply did not authorize these tariffs. But watch what the two moves do together, because this is the point of the reckoning. They let Thomas's tariff dissent sit consistently beside his votes in Gundy and Consumers Research. In those cases, he saw an abdication of the core legislative power and he voted to stop it. In the tariff case, he concluded the power in question was not part of that core and that the statute reached it anyway. So for him, there was nothing to strike down. It was not that he abandoned non-delegation when his side needed him to. It was that his non-delegation has always had a specific shape, a protected core, and a wider zone of shared and delegable authority. And he placed the tariff power in the wider zone. Now, I have my own view, and I will give it to plainly and mark it as mine. I think that is a weak point in his opinion. I find it hard to see why the power to lay a tax at the border, a tax that lands on American importers and American consumers as surely as any other, sits outside the core lawmaking power that Article 1 reserves to Congress. The taxing power, the very first part of power Article 1 enumerates. I think the majority had the better of it. But, and this is the whole reason the reckoning matters, disagreeing with his conclusion is a completely different thing from convicting him of bad faith. His dissent is not the reasoning of a man protecting his team. It is the reasoning of a man applying a genuine, long-held, and specific theory of where the non-delegible core ends, and reaching, by that theory, a result I happen to think is mistaken. An admirer of Thomas should come away from this episode with that admiration intact and better informed about what it is an admiration of. not a man who votes against power, a man with a settled and demanding account of which powers Congress may never surrender, an account rigorous enough to produce an answer in this one case that I think is wrong, and that he thinks follows straight from his principles. That is what a good faith constitutional disagreement actually looks like. It is not everyone agreeing. It is serious people reasoning from real principles to conclusions that sometimes divide them. That is the reckoning, and it is truer than the tidy version I started with. The structural check on executive overreach is real, and it protected against a program of the left and a program of the right, but it did not do so through one doctrine of an unbroken block of justices, and it did not do so without honest disagreement among the very people most committed to the underlying principle. The check is real precisely because it is bigger than any one justice's route to it. It survives their disagreements. That is a sturdier thing to rest a republic on than a unanimous vote would ever be. Every week on Self-Evident, we go looking for the same thing. The moment an idea about human freedom first entered the world, and the reason why it still matters to you right now. Here's how the week works, and starting now, there is something new. It begins before the week even starts. The Sunday before, we publish a written piece on our website, the deep version, fully sourced, for the reader who wants the whole argument on the page. That is where the week is anchored. Then on Saturday, we tell the story, the thinker, the document, the turning point, the history itself. From the ancient world to the founding, that is our historical episode. On Tuesday, we bring it home. We take that piece of history and we hold it against a debate happening in America today. Because none of this is dead, every one of these ideas is still being fought over. That is our contemporary Part B episode. And now, on Thursdays, we'll be adding a third voice to the week. We're opening the conversation up. For several of the weeks remaining in this series, the week will close with an interview, a real conversation with someone who lives inside that week's theme. Some weeks that will be a politician making the case from inside the arena. Some weeks a historian who has spent a career in the sources we are only visiting. An economist to sharpen the argument about markets and money and power. A business person who feels the weight of policy in a way the rest of us only read about. And a host of liberty-minded individuals just like you, just like me, who have thought hard about what it means to be free. Here's why this matters. History can feel like it happened to other people a long time ago. It did not. The fight over who holds power, whether you are free or governed, is the same fight. It just wears different clothes in every century. When you hear someone living a fight today talk about the thinker who started it 400 years ago, the whole thing comes alive. The article gives you the depth, the history gives you the roots, the application shows you the stakes, and the interview puts a living face on it all. So join us, read it, then watch it. Saturday, Tuesday, and now Thursday. Every week, one question runs underneath it all. Did this leave us more free or more governed? Let us go find out together. And now, as always, the strongest case against the argument of this episode stated at full strength. Two serious objections stand here, and I am going to give each of them their due. The second one in particular, I'm not certain I can fully defeat. The first objection goes straight at the historical foundation of the argument, and it comes pointedly from scholars advancing an originalist historical critique of modern non-delegation, which is to say from within the very tradition the non-delegation revivalists claim as their own. The claim of this episode has been that the founders built a system in which Congress and Congress alone makes the law, and that modern delegation is a betrayal of that design. But a formidable body of scholarship says that is simply not true as a matter of history. The legal historians Julian Mortensen and Nicholas Bagley, in an influential study called Delegation at the Founding, argue that there was no non-delegation doctrine at the founding at all, that the founding generation delegated broadly and consistently, that the early Congress handed sweeping discretion to the executive without anyone treating it as a constitutional violation, and that the whole idea of a strict original prohibition on delegation is a modern invention. And they draw a devastating practical conclusion, one that Justice Kagan has pressed from the bench. If you actually revived a strong non-delegation doctrine, you might discover that the most modern federal government is unconstitutional. That the administrative state on which the entire country now depends rests on delegations that a serious non-delegation rule would sweep away. On this view, the non-delegation revivalists are not restoring the founders' vision. They are imposing a vision the founders never held in order to dismantle a government they would not recognize but might well have accepted. That's a serious objection, again made by serious people, and let us not pretend it away. There is another side to that scholarly fight, and because the question is genuinely contested, I will not present one side of an open dispute as though it were settled. Other scholars, working the same founding era sources, Illa and Werman among them, have pushed back hard. They argue that Mortenson and Bagley prove less than they claim, that the founders drew a real distinction between delegating the filling in of details, which everyone accepted, and alienating the core lawmaking power itself, which they did not. That the early statutes cited as sweeping delegations look, on closer inspection, more like grants of detail filling authority within limits Congress set, and telling that across all the founding era debate, almost no one ever stood up to argue that Congress could hand away its legislative power without limit, which would be a strange silent if such unlimited delegation was genuinely thought to be fine. The honest state of the question is this: it is a live and unsettled dispute over the founding era record, not a settled defeat for one side. What the founders precisely believed about delegation is contested ground, and anyone who tells you it is obvious in either direction is selling you something. I lean toward the view that the structural logic of Article 1, all legislative power in Congress, points against unlimited delegation. But I hold that as the better reading of a real argument, not as a fact that ends one. The second objection is harder, and it does not depend on history at all. It is the objection from governance, and it is the reason Justice Kagan's warning bites. Grant everything, the critic says. Grant that the founders wanted Congress to make the law. It does not matter, because a modern nation of 340 million people cannot be governed that way. Congress cannot set safe exposure limit for every industrial chemical. It cannot design the testing protocol for every new medicine, or the capital requirements for every class of bank, or the emission standard for every category of engine. These are technical judgments requiring expertise, speed, and constant revision, and a legislator of 535 generalists moving at the pace of a legislative calendar simply cannot do them. Delegation is not a betrayal of good government. It is the precondition of government at modern scale. To force every consequential rule back through Congress is not to restore the Constitution. It is to break the machine the country actually runs on. To trade a functioning administrative state for gridlock and paralysis dressed up as constitutional purity. I feel the force of that. Realistically, I do. And my answer does not dismiss it. It draws a line inside of it. The objection is the strongest when it is aimed at a position almost no one actually holds. The position that Congress must specify every technical detail itself, that no discretion may ever be handed to an expert agency. But that is not the non-delegation argument. Not even Gorsuch's demanding version. His line is not no delegation. His line is Congress must make the policy judgment. The executive may fill in the details. The agency may absolutely determine the parts per million, run the testing protocol, do the technical and factual work the legislators cannot. What the agency may not do is make the fundamental value choice, decide in effect how much economic pain is worth how much environmental benefit, or how much liberty is worth how much security, and then present that choice to the country as though Congress had made it. The line is not detail versus no detail. It is the policy judgment versus its execution. And that line, I think, answered Kagan's most of the government is unconstitutional warning more than it first appears. Because most of the administrative work the country depends on is exactly the detail filling and fact-finding that even strong non-delegation doctrine permits. What such a doctrine would actually threaten is not the machine of government. It is the specific practice of Congress announcing a pleasant goal, handing the entire hard choice to an agency, and then washing its hands of the result. The practice deserves to be threatened. I concede freely that drawing the line between policy and detail is genuinely hard, and that reasonable judges will disagree about where it falls in a given case. But that difficulty of drawing the line is not an argument for pretending the line is not there. It is an argument for the hard work of drawing it, which is, not incidentally, exactly the work Congress has spent a century avoiding. The liberty test, a recurring tool, the question of whether one group of people acting together may rightfully do what no individual among them could rightfully do alone. Usually we run it against the power the government claims. And today I want to run it against a power the government gives away, because the test works in that direction too, and it exposes something that 100 years of comfortable habit has hidden. Start with the individual. Suppose you're named the trustee of something precious, a child's inheritance, say, placed in your hands not for your benefit, but for the child's, to be guarded and administered on the child's behalf. And suppose that, finding the responsibility burdensome, you simply hand the whole trust over to a stranger, a powerful, interested stranger, and tell the child, from now on, he decides what happens to your inheritance, not I. Have you discharged your duty as a trustee? You have not. You have betrayed it. The trust was not yours to give away. It was given to you precisely so that you would stand between the child and everyone who might wish to take what is his. The moment you hand it off, you have not exercised your office. You have abandoned it. And your abandonment does not become honorable because the stranger you handed it to happens to be efficient. Now write that large, as the liberty test does. The lawmaking power was placed in the hands of Congress as a trust, held not for the members' benefit, but for yours, so that the rules you must live under would be made by people you can reach with a vote. Can a body of 535 representatives rightfully do what the individual trustee could not? Hand that trust to an executive because holding it is hard and the accountability is dangerous, and still claim they have governed? The number does not change the answer. This, again, is the fancy hats and larger mobs logic we come back to again and again. A power that no single trustee may rightfully give away does not become givable because 535 office holders vote to give it away together. Group size confers no right that the individual lacked. Positional authority confers no right that the individual lacked. If one trustee may not abandon the trust, neither may a chamber full of them, however many hands go up. The vote to abdicate is still an abdication. The fancy hat on the man who cast it does not make it anything else. And here's the point the resistance theorists would have understood in their bones, because it is the mirror image of the one thing they built. Beza's whole achievement was to say that the lesser magistrate's duty to protect the people is not suspended when the threat comes from above, that it becomes most urgent precisely then. The modern inversion is a magistrate who faces no threat from above at all, who is simply offered the chance to be relieved of the hardest duty and who takes it. The Huguenots feared the magistrate who would not stand up to a king. We have produced, in quiet comfort, the magistrate who hands the king his sword and goes home. The free people's protection was never that the legislators would be wise. It was that the power to make law would stay somewhere that the people could reach it. And a legislature that gives that power away has not made the people's lives easier. It has moved much of the law out of their reach and called the abdication a convenience. That is the liberty test in this moment. Not a power seized, a trust surrendered. And a free people that lets trustees surrender keeps the form of self-government while losing the substance. The ballot's still printed, the election's still held, and the rules that actually govern written more and more by people no ballot can touch. The historical episode ended with the Dutch facing a hard task. Not how to depose a king, but how to govern without one. We face a subtler version of the same problem. Our question is not how to resist a tyrant. It is how to persuade the office that was built to protect us to pick its own sword back up. This Thursday, we close the week with something new. I will be joined by John Thomas, an educator, a church elder, and the Libertarian Party of Pennsylvania's nominee for lieutenant governor. A man who has thought hard about exactly this history and who is running, as it happens, for an office that is almost literally a lesser magistrate. We will take the ideas of this week off the page and into the arena. What an office can actually restrain, where a state or local authority may lawfully say no, and where the line runs between principled interposition and mere defiance. I hope you will join us for it. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been Episode 6, Part B, of Self-Evident, The Road to 1776 on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com, where you will find all written articles as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause, the New Leviathan, and Empire of Liberty. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes. And follow me on X at jkellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.